Welcome to my review of the 1959 film The Mummy. Let me say already, this is a much better film than the Tom Cruise version, which came out like 60 years later and had a million times the budget. I'll probably never review that film, by the way, because I really didn't like it at all. But if I ever did a Mummy films ranking video, which sounds quite fun actually, I might allow myself to speak about the Tom Cruise version for maybe 20 or 30 seconds, but that would be about it. Now, this 59 version was directed by Terence Fisher and written by Jimmy Sangster, two names synonymous with a lot of the early Hammer films. It stars Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, two actors who are absolute dynamite every time they were on screen together. Whenever I'm watching a Cushing and Lee film for the first time, I feel like I would if I had two aces in my hand at the start of a poker round. I can't lose. Now, there were four Mummy films in the Hammer series. This was the first. I vaguely remember the second and the third. I don't think they were as good as this one. I can't remember a fourth, but we'll get to all those eventually because I'm planning to go through them all. The story for this sees a group of archaeologists hunting for relics in Egypt, and they uncover a mummy's tomb. The locals warn them not to go inside because dangers await the unwary and all that stuff. But they go in anyway, and 3 years later, back in England, they start to get picked off one by one by a mummy. So simple story, but very effective. Christopher Lee plays the mummy. I love the way they dress him up in this. In the more modern day versions of the mummy, even the good ones like the Brendan Fraser one, you see a lot of CGI on the mummy, especially around the jawline, I've noticed. But with the Christopher Lee version, it's all practical effects, it's all makeup. What they've done is they've just covered him in bandages in the traditional way, but then early in the film they drop him into this bog, so he's then caked from head to toe in all this dirt and grime, and it's a really scary looking look. Definitely the scariest looking mummy I've ever seen on screen. I get why they've done this. They didn't want to just have him looking like a pure white mummy that's looked like it's just walked out of a costume shop and you can see all the paper clips holding the bandages together. There's a secondary antagonist in the form of this Egyptian guy. He's the one you see at the start of the film warning the travellers not to go into the tomb, but when they do, he takes it upon himself to get revenge on behalf of the gods. So he uses an incantation to bring the mummy to life. He doesn't travel to England with the mummy side by side with him on Pan Airways in second class, although that would be funny. He sends the mummy by post in a casket, but when it turns up, these stupid postmen are delivering the casket on the back of a wagon, but they drive too fast, so the casket falls off the wagon into this bog, and that's how the mummy gets all dirty. But it's a little bit convenient because most of this film, in the England portion of the movie, takes place in this quaint little village. It doesn't look like the sort of place that would be full of bogs. Probably there's one bog that's like 50 foot wide and the mummy just happens to fall into it, but I'm not criticising, it's charming. Lee's movements as the creature are absolutely spot on. I think the big danger when you play this sort of role is that you do it too robotic, a bit too much like this. But there's just enough that's erratic and jolty about this performance which keeps it exciting, especially when the creature's lunging for somebody. But Lee was getting adept at playing universal monsters by this stage of his career. He played Dracula the year before this movie. He played Frankenstein's creature the year before that. And it didn't hurt him as an actor that he was so tall, so he could cover the length of a room in very few strides while still appearing to be walking very slowly. He never played the mummy again after this film, and he never played Frankenstein's creature again after the initial film in that series, even though there were lots of sequels. So I can only imagine that maybe he didn't find these overtly physical roles with very little dialogue to be that rewarding for his career. Maybe that's the reason. Another man who would never appear in another Hammer mummy film was Peter Cushing. He plays John Banning in this film, one of the men who the mummy is after. Banning is your typical upper-class aristocrat English gentleman, the type of which that Cushing played so well. He's very wealthy, it seems. He's got a study the size of a small ballroom. When the mummy storms this place, Banning's got plenty of time to react then. He keeps a shotgun in here, and he keeps a spear on top of one of his cabinets to use as a defensive weapon. I look at this thing and think, did he find this on some archaeological dig in the Amazon before he got interested in Egypt? But it's a nice touch for the character. At the start of the film, he's got a really bad leg, which means he's confined to his tent while his chums are out discovering the main chamber. But I kind of think that as the main character, it should be him who's unearthing this place. And what it means is that for the rest of the movie, Cushing has got to act with a gammy leg, which can't have been easy for him. Did Cushing himself just happen to have a bad leg during the filming of this, and that's why they had to introduce this plot point? Or was this just their way of making sure that Banning and the Egyptian prophet don't meet until later in the film? I don't know. The sets in some of the early Egypt scenes are really impressive. I don't know where they were filming exactly or what they were filming on, but there seems to be a lot of depth around the outside of the screen with the palm trees and the little details. It makes me sad, actually, once we realise we're going back to Blighty. The inside of the burial chamber looks like it's had a lot of work spent on it as well, and it does make me laugh how clever the Egyptians supposedly were when it came to designing traps and contraptions in these places. I mean, this one guy, he pulls this thing on one side of the room, and that makes a door open on the other side of the room with a mummy behind it. But I mean, the counterweights in the ceiling and things must be absolutely perfect to pull this off. It would take most people months to figure something like this out, but seemingly the Egyptians could put it together on the same afternoon they were conducting a burial ceremony. Back in England, the sets are as opulent as you would expect, and the bog, as improbably deep as it is, does look really good. There's some good comic relief in the film. Those two guys I mentioned earlier who dropped the casket into the bog, I think one of them's Irish, and at one point he spots the mummy outside, and in a panic he runs into the local pub, quickly downs a couple of shots, and he says to his mates, 10 feet tall he was, and swathed in bandages. Always makes me laugh in these old films, these characters you see sort of drinking their lives away in the pub and occasionally passing comment on the movie that they're a part of. About halfway through the film, we get a flashback segment which shows us how the mummy became the mummy. So Christopher Lee gets to spend some time out of his bandages. His character used to be a kind of high priest who was having an affair with this Cleopatra type woman, but she dies one day, so the Egyptians bury her in the chamber we see at the start of the film. But Christopher Lee, being the naughty boy that he is, sneaks back in there after hours and tries to resurrect her, so they condemn him to being buried alive in an upright coffin. Now, if it was me being forced to walk into that thing, presumably to starve to death, I would probably be like this, you know, trying for all the world to wriggle free, as futile as it might be. But Lee just walks in and takes it, as if he's having his mugshot taken down at an Egyptian police station or something. Also weird is the fact that to commemorate this woman's death, they kill 100 people in her honour. It's a strange way to honour somebody. We only see 6 of the deaths, like 6 handmaidens, I think. They're all forced to line up, and 6 guards with scimitars go behind them. And then Lee gives the nod. I don't think they've buried him by this point. And then these women get killed, but it seems such a waste of life. I mean, these women are all sort of in their mid-20s, nice looking. I just don't get the Egyptians sometimes. Now, if you've seen the 99 version of The Mummy with Brendan Fraser, you'll know that this backstory pretty much gets repeated in that film, but at the start of the movie here, we get the backstory in the middle, and I kind of prefer it in the middle. I think it just breaks up the main story nicely, plus it gives us a chance to go back to some of those really nice Egyptian sets I was talking about earlier when we've just spent a chunk of time in England. If I had to name any downsides about the film, because I think I've been mostly positive so far, I would name 2. So firstly, as much as I enjoy the flashback segment, I think it could have been a little bit shorter. It does go on a little bit. This film comes in at 88 minutes. I think they could have trimmed maybe 3 or 4 minutes from various places, just made it a bit tighter. But then again, cinema goers did have more patience in the old days than us millennials. Also, of the 3 men who are being hunted by the mummy, only Banning is an interesting character. The other 2 are just pretty dull, middle-aged men, really. One of them gets killed in a kind of psychiatric facility type place, and when his carer's putting him to bed, he distinctly says, look, if you need anything, press the button on the back of the bed, don't run to the door and bang it or shout or do anything like that, because nobody will hear you. So he leaves the room, and literally a few minutes later, the mummy starts barging his way through the window. And the old guy in the bed, what does he do? Ignores the button, just goes to the door. Ah, let me out, let me out. Before we wrap up, let me just show you the version of the film that I have for this. I've got a Blu-ray. It cost me £20, which is quite pricey given the fact that there are no features on this, but it is a very clear picture. I don't know if they cleaned it just for this or what, but it looks good. So definitely worth the investment if you're into this sorts of thing. Princess Ananka, that's the name of the woman who gets buried at the start of the film, and wouldn't you just know it, Banning's wife in the present day looks exactly like Ananka, which comes to Banning's rescue at a certain point in the film. It wouldn't surprise me if the same actress who played Banning's wife is also lying in the casket in Egypt, but you'd have to tell me. Right, let's get to the bag of terror and find out what sort of score we've got for this. Oh, one's fallen on the floor. That's the half. 1.5, 2.5, 3.5 out of 5. That's a very good score for such an old film. I first saw this back in the 90s when I was a teenager, like 13, 14. I watched it very late at night and really enjoyed it. And I've come back to it like 25 years later with this Blu-ray. I've seen it a second and a third time now, quite close together. So yeah, it's definitely one of my favourite Hammer films, I think. So definitely worth checking out. I'll be back soon with another Hammer horror review. I think I'm going to do Hound of the Baskervilles next. But until next time, cheerio, bye-bye. Oh, and one more thing, we do have another pin for the horror locations map, and it's the first one for Africa. So there's a pin in Egypt, so that's all good.